The racist pogroms that took place in Belfast this week were shocking. What we witnessed in Northern Ireland was racists burning down the homes of people they believed to be migrants or just non-white. Lives were put at risk and livelihoods were destroyed. Now, in response, some politicians on the far right have been reluctant to condemn this violent racism. More bizarrely, some high-profile journalists have denied it even happened.
To suggest that these skirmishes that we've seen in Belfast tonight, because they weren't riots. There weren't people marauding through the streets with pitchforks.
There was a house set on fire, Beverly. There was a house set on fire. We've seen numerous pictures of fires ablaze in Belfast. This is disgraceful, violent behaviour that is not going to get anyone anywhere. It's going to further terrify communities who are already traumatised by the horrific images that were shown around the world from last night.
And what you have just done is precisely the rage baiting that I am trying to do the opposite of.
What are you talking about?
You are saying, but people's houses are burned down. This is awful. I'm saying, actually, it isn't that dramatic. There aren't bodies piled up in hospital
Someone's
tonight,
house
Matthew.
being burnt down in a riot is not that dramatic. What are you saying, Bev? What words are you allowing out of your mouth?
There was no riot. There was no riot.
There was no riot.
There is not a house that has been burnt down.
There was no riot. There is not a house that has been burned down. That was Beverly Turner, host at GB News, claiming that the pogroms in Belfast, I suppose, did not in fact happen. And she said very explicitly no houses were burned down. Now, you know some were. We're just going to show you some footage anyway, just to remind you. All of this is footage from Tuesday evening. So before she was speaking there, multiple houses set on fire, multiple families, including one with a 2-month-old baby, being forced to flee their homes. This footage was all available at the time of Turner's broadcast. Indeed, much of it had already been shown on her channel. Let's look at the rest of that extraordinary exchange.
Did you or did you not see the image of a house on fire?
We've seen
in Belfast.
Yes, but I've seen.
That's not that dramatic. It's pretty dramatic to me.
Your definition. That is, when you use phrases like far right and riots,
Beth, we're going round in circles.
That is not what that is. But
what do you think it is? When a house gets burned down and you had your reporter on the ground who you spoke to at the beginning of this show talking about multiple fires in Belfast caused by civil disorder.
That's right.
You're not calling that a riot? What do you want to call it?
Fires.
What do you want to call it?
No, I'm not calling it a riot.
What do you want to call it then?
I'm not calling it a riot.
What are you calling it?
Because there aren't people in hospital tonight because of what's gone on there. There aren't people in hospital. And I think you are precisely the problem in that you are whipping up the hatred. You are exaggerating. You are exaggerating what's happened on the streets of Belfast tonight. You have the temerity to call me the problem when I'm calling out violence in Belfast. My show. I'm talking. I am saying that the commentators that come on the TV like you say, this is outrageous. These were riots tonight. There weren't riots tonight, Matthew. There's a few teenagers who have set alight vehicles and it has been a busy night for the police, and I am not diminishing the reaction, but don't try to whip up the British public into thinking that there is civil war on the streets tonight and people are out with their pitchforks.
That's outrageous, Beverly. I've never said there's civil war. That's an outrageous allegation. I've never said that. You're floundering around for accusations because you are unprepared to properly call out. Sorry. You are unprepared to call out outrageous behaviour on the streets of Belfast. Put me on a single shot, please.
We need to move on. Put me on a single shot, please. Get this guy off the screen because, I mean, in this case, he's just so obviously right. And then resorting to saying, you're saying there's a civil war in this country. Now, that was Matthew Stadlen, by the way, the commentator who was a guest on GB News. The one channel in the UK with the most journalists who talk about there being a civil war happening is GB News, right? That's why they refer to migrants as fighting age men. It's to constantly get in people's this idea that there's about to be this kind of race war. Those are sort of the parts of, I mean, there are lots of parts of GB News I find very offensive, but it is that sort of, that constantly stoking this civil war narrative that I find most dangerous, most damaging, most disgusting, and the idea that that's what Matthew Stadlen, the guest, was doing is completely bizarre. Not bizarre, outrageous. Beverly Turner there also said it was a difficult night for the police. So sort of like that's who really suffered here? No one else. It was just boys, just teenagers setting fire to cars. Tough for the police, but let's not get carried away. Well, let's have a look at just one example of first-hand testimony from people who were affected by those riots, those pogroms. This is local resident Jamie Corrie.
I was actually standing right there watching my whole house just go up slowly but surely, and that was it. There's literally nothing I could have done about it. I told them and all when they were lighting the car on fire, that's my property where our car is, and they still didn't care. They were like, oh, it'll be safe. I knew straight away it wasn't going to be safe. The car was actually like that, parked on the side of the footpath.
Obviously, I mean, there's been so much testimony this week especially people of colour, people from migrant backgrounds being just completely terrified in Belfast and elsewhere. Lots of houses burnt down. Banseka, what was Beverly Turner thinking there?
I don't think she was thinking at all. Just a kind of...
I gave you the opportunity for that one, didn't I?
Thank you very much for setting me up for that one. Yeah, her brain just sort of vacated momentarily there. I don't know. I mean, we are so kind of far down the lens in the terrain of lies, mistruths, half-truths, taking small fragments of information and then blowing them up out of proportion very, very quickly. That perhaps she's just so in the kind of the vein of that and the sync of that now it's just, well, actually that thing that you saw didn't happen. Like that's where we are now. And I laughed when I saw the clip, of course, because it's so absurd. There's an absurdity to it. But of course, within the absurdity, there's something seriously dangerous there. I think about the collusion between politicians, reform and restore agitating, particularly on the right, and GB News. And GB News in many ways kind of are reform, that the two are quite interchangeable, right?
I mean, literally their presenters are reform politicians. It is reform TV.
They are symbiotic bodies, right? One and the same, two limbs on the same body almost. So, that relationship between all of these composites is really hammering, I think, our ability to be able to think clearly. And I don't know if you found this as well, but even I'm finding it very difficult to think clearly at times with this barrage of information and this barrage of misinformation and the parameters of the conversation being so much about ethnicity. I think your colleague Ash Sarkar said, we're now just primarily viewing crime through the lens of race, which can't be healthy. Even if you do think that there's a hint of two-tier injustice against white people in this country, for example, even if you think that can't be healthy and that can't be normal for us to be viewing it kind of solely through this lens.
So the pushback, obviously, this is separate from the appalling clip of Beverly Turner and the appalling riots, just completely indefensible. The argument that is made on the right or the centre, or even just some sort of unorthodox people on the left, is to say, well, this obsession with race, like the left sort of are not in a great position to sort of complain about it, because it was the case that whenever there was an arrest or police violence or whatever, it was always immediately about race if the person was black.
Yeah.
And so the argument is that Black Lives Matter and that movement, some of its excesses sort of made everything so much about race that now the right are doing it. It's harder to sort of sound like an honest broker when you say, actually, maybe it's more complicated.
Yeah. And I understand why some people might say that. Two things I would add to that. One is that when it comes to obviously, disparities in how black and ethnic minority people are treated by the police, that is backed up by significant amounts of data. With what we're talking about with the horrible case of Henry Novak, for example, or this awful case. We don't know much about this awful case of the beheading, to be fair. There's still lots of evidence to come out yet about that. But we're getting these kind of individual sporadic cases that then being built to build a case that this entire system is rigged against you. So the data's just not really quite there. If you want to make a point about perhaps the sort of liberal identity politics infection into how the left built its case around racism, I think we can do that. I think one of the jarring things about some of this conversation is actually, hey, there were people on the left who did sound the alarm about certain ways of framing things, which didn't include talking about racial liberation in a way that's also about white people. That was what I wrote this week, and I was thinking to myself, one of the things I was thinking, amongst obviously feeling terrible for the people who are the primary targets of this violence that we're now seeing, is that this is fundamentally illiberating for white people. There's not going to be a liberation for white people as a result of this way of thinking and this obsession with whipping up white grievance. It's a tool for people in power. It's for people like Nigel Farage to ascend to the highest levels in office so he can keep getting his crypto money or whatever. But it's not going to liberate your average white British person. Your liberation lies in my liberation and vice versa. The safety of Henry Novak, a white boy who was, mistreated by the police. Ultimately, I think that's a key reason as to why he dies, is the police do not treat him with the care that anybody who's, been stabbed deserves. That is also a reflection of the ways in which, of course, lots of black and brown people have been treated and mistreated by the police as well. So our safety and security is bound up together. That's an argument that I think the left has to make, and has to make very clearly and very strongly. And I do think whilst there are liberal identity inflections in how we talked about race and racism or crime on the left, I do think there have always been left-wing people who've been making that case.
Is it too... because I think it's always a bit easy for people on the left to say, actually, the problem was just the Liberals. Because I suppose an argument that's been made, again, this is a million miles from what Beverly Turner said. This is a million miles from sort of the Belfast riots, which is just appalling. No one needs to complicate that, right? Yep. That's just out and out racism and terrible journalism as much as anything else. But in the case of this argument that sort of the left didn't necessarily behave with as much responsibility as they should have done to now sort of be in a very strong position to say, why are you making everything about race? So say an example with Henry Novak, there are people sort of on the right saying the police did get some documentation saying they shouldn't treat everyone the same because you're trying to sort of correct disparities because you're assuming that any kind of disparity is because of discrimination and therefore you have to do some kind of positive discrimination. We shouldn't be colorblind. And their argument is they've come along and they've seen Henry Novak and they've thought, okay, well, this is an issue about racism. We have to take the racism bit really seriously. And then people saying, well, there's not actually enough evidence to really suggest that it was a race issue. They kind of thought the guy was drunk. That's the best explanation. So something that makes you think a bit about is the Chris Cabot case, where he's a guy who gets shot. Obviously, tragic case, but immediately everyone on the left says, it's because he's black. This is white supremacy. This is racism. The trial happens. It turns out he had been involved in a shooting earlier in the week. The police had good reason to think whoever was driving that car had a gun. And then he did sort of ram a bunch of police cars. So to me, it doesn't seem like that case really was about race. Might be tragic, might be that the police did something wrong. But the best explanation for that, for me, isn't the race one. But there was a period on the left where everything, sort of the left weren't willing to sort of say, well, maybe it shouldn't be viewed through a racial lens. Maybe this is just a lens of crime and a difficult policing situation. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I can't remember enough about the specific details of the Chris Cabot case because I don't want to talk too much, I suppose, about the specificities of how much that was driven by race or not. Obviously, a lot of the time, as I said, there is a lot of data that supports that we live in a policing system which does over-criminalise lots of different groups of people. Actually, I think working class people in general are over-criminalised, for example, as well. But we have a policing system that is reflected in the data. Black children are something like 8 times more likely to be strip searched, for example. So when an incident like Child Q, if you remember, comes up with the little black girl, 15-year-old black girl was strip searched by the police when she's on her period, people get angry about that very quickly because it reflects a disparity that I suppose is well worn in a very long period of time of discrimination. If we want to make the point to say we should view things with a more complex lens, maybe the grooming gang scandal is a good example of that, where we can say there might be multiple things at play. I would push back very heavily on some of the arguments that the right have made about saying there was this DEI policy paper and that, meant that the police suddenly magically had a totally different culture that now was actually really pro-black and really pro, minorities to the detriment, pardon me, of white people. I think anyone who's ever worked in a soulless corporate job knows that just because something's written down on a DEI policy paper, which is often a kind of box-ticking exercise I'm sure many of us will be familiar with, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's reflective of the culture of the organisation itself. And I will also add, finally, again, there were conversations on the left about diversity, equity and inclusion, diversity initiatives that were ultimately, for many of us, hollow. For me, racial liberation isn't about a bunch of diversity inclusions in the kind of corporate sphere. It's about redistribution of wealth, safety and security, all these things that will liberate all of us, including all white people as well. So again, there has been, I think, a well-worn discussion amongst anti-racist campaigners about making sure that we do not allow racism and anti-racism, to become the domain of kind of corporate solutions. but that we have a material understanding of racism that actually speaks to how people materially live, so we can ensure that people live materially better. And there's always been that critique of those kind of DEI initiatives on the left as well. We have to be very careful about how we make them. I don't want to create ground for the right to start saying, this is DEI gone mad. I don't want to do that. But we do also have to be very honest about the ways in which these corporate, elite captured sort of ideas about race were just useless as well.
Yeah, we could talk about this a lot. I think the sort of the return of colorblindness, I think, is interesting, because I think maybe it was a mistake to go away from it. But we'll have to have this discussion another time.